it play and call it work.
Matthew's Thoughts.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to the episode 1 of a new show called Matthew's Thoughts. This is a show where you get, guess what, my thoughts about various subjects. It's kind of be like a review show, but sometimes we might cover other topics in miniature wargaming as well. This is different than the sit and talk in that I'll just be covering one topic, and it should theoretically be shorter than the sit and talks, although sometimes I can get rambly, as you may already know if you have watched any of videos with me in it whatsoever. And if you're not a big fan of me, if you prefer to watch some of the other producers, well, this is not the show for you. And luckily, we have lots of other shows. So make sure you leave a comment in the comment section below of what topics you'd like me to cover, whether it's reviewing something else that's just come out, something old, talking about issues in miniature wargaming, whatever it is you want, but it has to be miniature wargaming related. Today's show, I'm going to be talking about Death from the Skies and giving my quasi-review on the book, having played 2 games, which thus makes me a superior expert on exactly how much this book is good or is not good, even though in both of those games we didn't do much dogfighting just because it never really happened, because that's just the way that most likely is going to happen every single time you do it. So take whatever you like here with a grain of salt. Now, first off, Death from the Skies, it's not a supplement to 40K. It is not proposed or optional rules. They are actually replacement rules for flyers. Does this mean that you have to buy it with your gaming group? Absolutely not. Just like every other rule in 40K, you can house rule not to use it. So a lot of people have been crying about it, saying that I can't believe that they would make me buy a book to do it. And you know what? I agree with that. 40K has become rather bloated. There are rumors of 8th edition coming out soon, like soonish being like next year, in which case a lot of this will get maybe compiled together, kind of like when Escalation and Stronghold and Apocalypse all came out. And then when the 7th edition book came out, they folded a lot of that into it, for better or for worse, whether you liked it or not. And so we're not really going to talk about that. Assuming that these rules replace the flyer rules, I'm going to give you my opinion on what I think about everything in here. So there's a lot of things introduced in Death from the Skies. Namely, you have the new dogfighting phase, which happens once per game round. That's something that some people have been getting wrong. It's not every turn, it's every game round. That's very important because of air superiority, which we'll talk about in a moment. Also, we've got new stats for fighters. I don't mean their armor values have changed, although I made the mistake of thinking that some of them had. I mean that they've received new types of stats: pursuit, agility, and their combat roll. And this has probably caused the biggest upset. The combat roll is what I'm talking about, because most of these beloved flyers have lost the ability to fire at other flyers, which of course makes no sense, but we are playing a game based 40,000 years in the future, where they're still wearing armor from World War II and firing guns at short range. So I guess we don't really have to talk about whether things make sense. It's more whether or not it works for the meta of the game. So fluff-wise, of course, things don't always make sense, because they can't, otherwise the game would be very boring, because most wars would be fought far, far away, just hurling bombardments at each other, or even from space, and it just wouldn't make for a very good 40K or a very good game whatsoever. So let's start with the dogfight phase. Essentially, the dogfight phase allows for fighters in reserve to fight each other. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds, because people are like, it's already bloated enough in 40K, we got the psychic phase added on, we've got all these extra things that we got to worry about, and now we have another phase in the game. It's not as big as other phases, and once you learn the rules and once you've done it a few times, it actually goes by pretty fast. Now, is it a good phase? I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Basically, you roll off. First off, you don't even have to do the phase. Now, the phase happens regardless of whether you want to do it or not, but both players can agree not to do it, in which case the phase is automatically over. And the reason for that is not because they don't like the rules, but maybe because they both have transports in reserve and they don't really want to risk firing at each other and losing their transport. Because if they lose a transport in reserve, they lose everything inside, unless they're a night scythe, of course, but even then that would really suck. It's more that if one player or both players want to actually try to shoot some of their flyers down before they come in, then you do the dogfight phase. Even if just one player wants to do it, you roll off. So you have a 50-50 chance of not doing it if you don't want to. On top of that, once you get into the dogfight phase, you've got these sub-phases. In the very first sub-phase, you both secretly choose what you're going to do, and it's kind of like a rock, paper, scissors thing. And if you win, you can choose to end the dogfight phase right there. So you have 2 chances, both which are kind of 50-50, depending on how you play your mind games for choosing the thing that you're going to do. And so if somebody wants to do it and the other player doesn't, there's really like a 75% chance that the person who doesn't want to do it is going to be able to make sure it doesn't happen. So that's where I say it's not as big a deal as it sounds. Now, if you do end up doing it, then your flyers, this is the one place where your flyers can actually fight each other, even if they're not Skyfire or fighters, because depending on how everything ends up, you basically are just simulating a battle between two fighters, and only two of them. The winner gets to choose one of their flyers in reserve, and they attack one of the other flyers in the other opponent's reserve that they also get to choose. And that's it. So it's not like if you have 6 flyers in reserve, you're going to have 6 flyers going and attacking their flyers in reserve. And by the way, flying monsters creatures are nowhere to be found in this book, so they have no additional rules, which means they get to keep Skyfire, which actually ups how strong they are, but sucks because armies like Tyranids are never going to get air superiority. Because air superiority is at the end of the dogfight phase, whether you do it or not. If one player has flyers in reserve and the other player does not, then they have air superiority, where they get +1 or -1 to their own reserve rolls, they get to choose, and -1 to their enemy's reserve rolls. So Tyranids, basically, as long as the opponent at least has 1 flyer in reserve, you're going to be at -1 reserves. Now, it's important to note that because the dogfight phase happens at the beginning of the game round, even if they have, you have 2 players. Let's say you have Necrons versus Eldar, and Necrons go first and then Eldar. But we do our dogfight phase, and the Eldar don't have any more flyers in reserve, but they still have other things in reserve, and the Necrons have a flyer in reserve, so they get air superiority. And then on their turn, let's say their flyers all come in from reserve. When we go to the Eldar turn, the Necrons still have air superiority because we haven't had a new dogfight phase. So even though there's no more flyers in reserve, the Eldar are still going to be at -1 reserves, or -2 if you've got the new the air superiority detachment, basically, which allows you to bring flyers no matter what, which is kind of nice and cheesy at the same time, but every formation detachment has allowed you to be cheesy if you really wanted to. And so that's an important note, that it does matter. Damage can be done. In the 2 games that I played, you're going to have a minimum of 2 dogfight phases if there are flyers on both sides, because turn 1 they don't come in, and turn 2 they do come in, but you have the dogfight phase first. So you are going to have it happen a couple times. But in both games that I played, spoiler alert, and I will have links to those games in the video description, by the way, we never really got to fight. It's either that in both cases the dogfight got disengaged before it could really get far into the game. So I don't know how potent it can be, although I can imagine that if you brought a fighter and shot down a transport full of guys, or a bomber, or some important flyer on the opponent's side, then that could be really, really annoying. So new combat roles, everything has become either an attack flyer, a bomber, or a fighter. Attack flyers and bombers, they're meant anti-ground, and they no longer can choose to Skyfire, unless their weapons specifically have Skyfire, which none of them do, except the one new fighter, which is a fighter. Fighters are better against anti-air. They get -1 ballistic skill against ground targets, which is anything that's not a skimmer, jet bike, flying monsters creature, or flyer. And they get to choose a Skyfire if they want to. So now fighters are your new anti-flyer. However, there are hardly any flyers in the entire game. The new Space Marine flyer is a fighter. The one Orc Dakajet is a fighter. And strangely, the one Space Wolf transport is a fighter, even though it makes no sense whatsoever. Now, there is an FAQ floating around for 40K, which is not official yet, that says that blasts and flamers will be able to hit flyers if they have Skyfire. So that can change things a lot, like giving the Bale Flame thing in the dogfight phase the ability to actually hurt the enemy flyer. But that's kind of strange, and I don't know if that'll stay. So it's really hard to conclude that in this discussion right now, because that could easily change before the FAQs become totally published and totally official, and then therefore rules binding, if we're looking at it as rules as written. And so these new flyer roles are kind of wonky in that what I found in the games that we played were that flyers sucked against other flyers, which before, the way to beat a flyer was simply to make sure you had flyers too. Well, now this is going to really shift the emphasis to both, of course, buying the new fighters and having the other fighters, but more importantly, having anti-air on the ground. For example, the hunters and stalkers for the Space Marines just became that much more important and that much more potent, and more, just if you're thinking tournaments and stuff, they're going to become maybe more an auto-include. I don't know. We just have to wait and see what the meta does there. But lots of anti-air is going to be important. So your mysterious objectives, giving you Skyfire, or flying monsters creatures, those are going to be the way to deal with other flyers. Now, of course, there are flyers which can switch to hover mode, and those ones are obviously going to be in danger when they do that, because your opponent's going to be like, sweet, that was the only time that I can actually fire at them. and try to take them down. Now, why would you ever put them in a hover mode? Well, we've got transports, but we've also got the new attack patterns. Now, this is a part that I really enjoy. Attack patterns basically allow you to fly your fighters in certain formations and gain certain benefits. Sucks for bombers most of the time because it only affects their bombs, but attack flyers basically gain all the benefits against ground targets, and fighters gain all the benefits against air targets. These range from ignoring cover to getting a 4-up invuln and interceptor on all their weapons, to being able to fly faster or fire after they go flat out, to there's just all sorts, or one of them that lets them choose a thing and they get preferred enemy against that thing, and everything else that is also that thing. So it's like, hey, orc boys, I get preferred enemy against you, and everything else that's an orc boy for the rest of the game. Now, a lot of these are hard to pull off because keeping your flyers in formation might be easy when they come in from reserve, but after that becomes tricky, which is where hover mode makes them all the more potent. Or having a high agility is really important, because with the new agility, you can do an agility test and take an extra 90-degree turn at any point in your movement, even right at the beginning when you make a 90-degree turn. If you pass an agility test, which for Eldar, super easy, having an agility of 5 on everything means that they're pretty much always going to be moving an extra 90 degrees, plus their vector dancer at the end. And then for Space Marines, it's a little harder because they're more the average agility of 2 and 3. And yeah, it's harder for other species to do that. But there is the added chance that you can kind of finagle. And it does add an interesting dynamic to the game, I find. Pursuit is more interesting in the dogfight phase, although it does make you go faster when you go flat out. So you have all these new stats, but there's a huge problem with the new stats, and that is that they did not include them for any of our Forge World flyers. Now, I'm assuming that they're going to come out with some sort of downloadable errata or update to all those flyers, because right now they are actually not allowed to be used in a regular 40k game. Now, of course, you can just say, well, we just won't use the Death in the Skies rules, and that is, of course, one way you can deal with it. But as of right now, there is no way to use this wonderful Xiphon or the Night Shroud Bomber, which is not this one, but it's a cool-looking one, or obviously any of your super heavies, or any of the Imperial Guard ones. In fact, they even forgot to put the Vendetta in the Death from the Skies book. Now, I think that was an error, because I noticed on their Facebook page when they introduced this, when they advertised on their Facebook, somebody actually replied to it saying, hey, you forgot to put the Vendetta in, and they said, just use the Valkyrie agility pursuit and stuff. And that's probably true, although it feels weird that a Vendetta is not a fighter. Although 3 twin-link glass cannons could be argued to be more anti-ground, obviously people loved bringing it to take out other flyers, because 3 twin-linked glass cannons to take out another flyer was awesome. Now they can't do that. Well, not easily anyways. You can still snap fire, of course, but we all know how effective that can be, which is not very at all. And then, of course, the book gives us the some new missions as well, 6 new missions, of which I've played 2, and I had a lot of fun with them, but they're easily gamed. So you have to make sure that if you're playing those missions that you don't play them seriously, that one of them, for example, lets you just have 5 fortifications however you want for free. And so I could have been like, well, I'll bring 5 bastions with quad guns and other upgrades, or a Fortress of Redemption, or all these different things. It doesn't specify. It just says have 5 of them, and your opponent obviously wouldn't have a chance. And so that's obviously not what you want to be doing. So overall, let me give you my impressions of this. I've told you kind of throughout, but if I'm concluding my thoughts, dogfight phase, I'm still up in the air about it. I don't think it's necessary. The air superiority thing seems kind of flawed. I don't like it. I don't like the manipulating reserves. Reserves was already hard enough, so just allowing somebody to bring a flyer to hurt your reserves even more means that you're going to have even more of a gentleman's agreement before. You're going to have more discussion with your opponent about whether you're bringing flyers or not. So, I give that a C or a C minus for the dogfight phase, maybe even a D. Now, when they do attack patterns, I'd give those an A+. I love them. I've played with them. They're hard to pull off, but when you do, they're very powerful, and I think that they feel right for the amount of power that they bring to the game because of what you have to pay in order to bring them on, which is several flyers. Because if you want to use the best ones, you're going to have 3 or 4 flyers in the same type of flyer, unless you're using a formation. So I really like the attack patterns. That's probably my favorite addition that the Death in the Skies book brings. Adding the pursuit and agility, I'm like a B in that area. I don't know if that was necessary to allow things to be able to turn an extra 90 degrees. That's nice, but it just makes the Eldar flyers that much more potent than they already were. And then the combat rolls I'm still on the fence about, so I'd give that a B or a C. because I don't like that a lot of them have lost Skyfire, but I kind of like that a lot of them lost Skyfire, but I don't like that they lost Skyfire, but I kind of do like that they lost Skyfire. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I'm going to have to play probably another dozen games with them before I have a final feeling for that. But a lot of it's going to be based off of how much anti-air somebody can bring from the ground, which certain armies like the Necrons have zilch. Now you don't count the obelisk because that thing doesn't do hardly anything against flyers anymore. It used to, but not anymore. And so you might think, well, boo-hoo, Necron's got a debuff. But the thing is, forget the balance issues. Just having an army that is totally unable to deal with it just doesn't make any sense unless you bring in like Forge World stuff, or you buy an Aegis Defense line with a quad gun, which is not very Necron-y unless you, of course, custom build your own. But it just doesn't feel right to have certain species just unable to deal with it. And so everything should have some anti-air. And the Night Scythe is not a fighter, it's an attack flyer, and so doesn't get the Skyfire. So yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not a huge fan of that idea. I think they could have done without it. And then, of course, lastly, we have the new missions, which I'm always a fan of new missions, even if they're not balanced whatsoever, because it just gives us new ways to play the game and play with your friends as well. And I've played 2 of the missions, and I had a lot of fun with them. And so, yeah, always new missions, always a good thing. A+. They updated the formations and stuff that existed for the flyers as well, and gave you a few new ones. And they gave a new detachment, which allows you to bring flyers, a minimum of 2, of course, and those are pretty cool. And so, yeah, overall, I think it's a cool book. Now, it does, of course, bring up that discussion about whether there's too much bloat in 40K, and I think the short answer to that is yes. But this is not the only problem. Did we need new flyer rules? Part of me wants to say yes, just because I personally wasn't seeing a lot of flyers in our games, but that's just our local meta here that we play in battle reports, which is very different than what you might see in a tournament or in your local gaming store. So those are my thoughts on the Death from the Skies book, so stay tuned for more of Matthew's thoughts, and make sure you leave a comment in the section below about what you want me to talk about in a future Matthew's Thoughts video. And of course, I'm going to put the links to the video in the video description to the 2 battle reports that we do, where we actually play with the flyers, and I had a lot of fun with those, so you can go and check them out. They've already been published for a couple weeks now, but if you haven't seen them yet, go and look at them, and you'll actually see all the new stuff pretty much in action. So thanks for watching. Happy wargaming.